I'd like to call the March 18 meeting of the Maryland Alcohol and Tobacco Commission to order. And I would like to begin with a motion for approval of the February 18 meeting minutes.
So moved.
Second the motion, Robert Poole.
Okay, we have a motion, we have a second. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 The ayes have it. And I'm going to call on Mr. Hatcher for the executive director's report.
Okay, I have two items to report for today. One I've already taken care of before we went online, was to introduce Mr. James Hawk as the superintendent of the state police's chief of staff. He is a non-voting member of the commission, and he is joining us today to participate. The other item is I'm happy to report that I have obtained permission to hire a contractual person for the ATC, and that person's duties will include assisting the commissioners in their functions that they must accomplish as part of the duties that they have.
So, Mr. Hatcher, tell us a little bit about the timeline for accepting applications and going through the interview process. When do you expect to have somebody hired and on-ramped?
Well, I don't have a true handle on the timeline on being able to bring a person on board. We're going to look for a person that has the qualifications to perform duties that need to be done by the commission, which is these numerous studies and so forth that need to be accomplished. So we'll be looking for somebody with some set skills that might be able to accomplish that mission for us, as well as doing other duties within the ATC as needed. So individually, you could reach out to me and give me any thoughts of the abilities of the person you're looking for. And then we can discuss the finalization at the next meeting.
Terrific. So, Tony, where is it going to be advertised? Is it going to be just
It's going to be
internally
internal.
advertised? You're going to post, or are you going to post it externally?
I believe it's going to be internal here. And we don't have to go through all the external process we have to go to hire a person with a PIN. The person will be contractual, so it's easier to bring them on board very quickly once we find a person that is viable for the position.
And Tony, the anticipated salary range is going to be what, or is that still subject for?
That's still subject to review by myself and the rest of the team.
Okay. Terrific. Are there any questions for Tony? Murray, I forget, do we have to motion to approve the executive director's report?
No.
Okay.
No, you're not. It's just a report.
Wonderful.
No.
And I was going to introduce Mr. Hawk at the conclusion of the report. I'm glad, Tony, that you took care of it for me. Jim, it's a pleasure to have you here. Jim, as Tony mentioned, is representing the Maryland State Police and our superintendent. Jim, do you anticipate being a regular participant in these meetings moving forward?
I do. I've actually attended the last meetings. I did it by phone because we have trouble with Microsoft Teams, but Tony sent me a link and I was able to do it appropriately this time. At this point, yes. And I spoke with Tony earlier today just about what you expect from us. Wanted to make sure we were able to provide whatever service you need. And he suggested to me some services that the enforcement unit maybe provides to us. So at this point, I will probably be a regular attendee unless the colonel decides to have somebody else on board. And I appreciate it. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, Jim, it's nice to have you here. Hearing no other questions for Tony, this is probably as good a time as any just to reiterate verbally what I shared with each of you in writing, that this will sadly be my final meeting as the chairman of the ATC. And it's with great sadness that I did, in fact, tender my resignation earlier this week. But I think back to the fact that I teach a course at Johns Hopkins in crisis communication, and one of the first things I always tell my students is that the best and most effective way to avoid a crisis, or to react to a crisis, is to avoid getting into one in the first place. And I would characterize my decision as precautionary and preventative in nature, just recognizing that the work that I'm doing as a private sector consultant is going to be increasingly untenable, if not truly irreconcilable, with my responsibilities as an impartial, objective state regulator. So this commission has far too much work to do. The work you're going to be doing is far too important, and it's going to be occurring under far too much public scrutiny to have any added layers of drama. So to avoid those inevitable collisions, I feel it's best to step down. So it's with great sadness that I'm going to be leaving as the presiding officer of this meeting, but I look forward to joining you in April as just one of many participants on the call. And I know that moving forward with Tony and with the board members and with our contributing members, the commission is going to be in very, very good hands. So with that said, I'm going to go to the next item on the agenda, which is Mr. Hatcher and Jeff Kelly, our Director of Field Enforcement for the Comptroller of Maryland, as well as Kathy Hoke, someone who is familiar to anyone in Maryland who has worked in the public health space, particularly in the fight to keep tobacco and tobacco-related products out of the hands of underage consumers. Kathy is the director of the Center for Tobacco Regulation at the University of Maryland Carey School of Law. And collectively, Tony, Jeff, and Kathy are going to give us an overview of Maryland's legal and regulatory framework for how we oversee tobacco. So colleagues, it's yours.
Thank you, sir. And I would like to say it's been a pleasure working with you, and you will be missed.
Thank you, Tony.
Okay, I'm going to do a quick PowerPoint on the distribution of tobacco products in the state of Maryland. Last month, you had an overview of the distribution of alcoholic beverages, the three-tier system. Well, tobacco was not much different. There was some irregularities from the three-tier system, but the three-tier system does lie there with the tobacco enforcement and the distribution of tobacco products. So I'm going to start a PowerPoint. I'm hoping we can get through this without any technical problems. Is everybody able to see that screen?
No.
Okay. As you see you have the major players in the cigarette industry, which first is the manufacturers who sell the unstamped cigarettes to wholesalers in the state of Maryland. The wholesalers are the only ones in the state of Maryland permitted to possess unstamped cigarettes. As part of the regulatory side of the Alcohol and Tobacco Commission, we have to ensure that the wholesalers stamp their unstamped cigarettes in a timely manner. The law states you're supposed to stamp them within 72 hours of receipt. So periodically, one of our agents may go to a wholesaler site and do a site inspection to see if they're complying with that law. The wholesalers, you purchase their stamps, cigarette sells them to sub-wholesalers and retailers. The sub-wholesaler is allowed to only possess stamped cigarettes that they receive from a wholesaler.
Tony, can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
Does Maryland currently have any cigarette manufacturers?
I cannot answer that question directly. The last I remembered, we did not have a manufacturer in Maryland, but I'm not positive. I can get that answer for
Okay.
you and get back to you.
No. I just want to see how large the footprint for manufacturing is still in the state of Maryland. Thank you.
Okay.
Hey, Tony, and I think you said you were going to display on, you're not displaying if you think you are. Your display is not on the share screen.
It's not displaying?
It's
No.
not.
Tony.
Hold on a second. Let me try it again. I am sorry about that.
There you go.
There you go.
Got it?
Yep.
Okay, great. You still have it? I had to change the screen.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So The next slide here shows you basically the distribution route of the cigarettes. The manufacturers produce the product, they package it up, and then it goes to the wholesaler. And then the wholesalers put it through the stamping process, and there's an image of a typical stamping operation machine, and then they put them back in their cartons. Once that goes through, the wholesalers will then distribute it to your sub-wholesalers and or to retailers at that point. A sub-wholesaler also is allowed to sell to another sub-wholesaler. And then the retailers, of course, sell it to the consumer. Dealing with other tobacco products, the manufacturers sell the OTP on which the tobacco tax has not been paid to a licensed wholesaler. Other tobacco products wholesaler licenses buy OTP on which the tobacco tax has not been paid directly from the manufacturer, and then sell that OTP on which the tobacco tax has not been paid to another licensed wholesaler if the executive director of the ATC specifically authorizes it. The other tobacco products retail licensees buys the OTP on which the tobacco tax has been paid from a wholesaler and buy premium cigars or type tobacco on which the tobacco tax has not been paid from a manufacturer. So they can buy directly from the manufacturer, and then that licensee is responsible to submit payment of the taxes due on that product. It used to be for OTP in the early stages of licensing for that product that it was a either or. The wholesaler could be responsible for paying the other tobacco tax to the controller's office at that time, or the retailer could be responsible for that. Then the law changed that it all went through the wholesaler. A tobacconist license may buy OTP in which a tobacco tax has not been paid from a manufacturer. And then, of course, they're responsible for paying the tax once they obtain the product. And then we have our electronic smoking devices. And this delineates your manufacturer's license who sells to a wholesaler or to a licensed vape shop. Sell to a consumer if the licensee manufactured the device and the consumer purchases or orders the device through the mail or electronic network. Manufacturers can also hold a retailer or a vape shop vendor license. They may distribute to a licensed ESD retailer or vape shop vendor. The ESD wholesaler distributor license or ESD wholesaler import license may sell to retailers and vape shop vendors. May buy ESD directly from a manufacturer and a wholesaler, distributor, or wholesaler importer. May sell to wholesale distributors or wholesaler import. ESD retail license allows to sell to the consumer, buy from the wholesale distributor or wholesale importer. Retailer may also hold a manufacturer's license. Distribute sample ESD products to consumers in the state. And this is a breakdown of the ESD license for the manufacturer, the wholesaler, and the retailer. It's quite diverse. Where in cigarettes, the manufacturer can't sell to a retailer. They can only sell to a wholesaler. In the ESD license, the manufacturer, as you see, can distribute to a retailer. And they also hold a retailer's license. And then the wholesaler sells to retailers. They buy from the manufacturer and buy and sell from wholesalers. And then the retailer sells to your consumers, distributes samples to consumers, buy from the wholesaler, and may hold a manufacturer's license. And finally, some recent law changes and regulations that deal with tobacco products. October 1 of 2019, House Bill 1169 changed the minimum sales age for all tobacco products in Maryland to 21 from the age of 18. After that, in January of 2020, FDA bans flavored cartridge-based ESD products. March 14th of this year, House Bill 732 from the 2020 session was put into effect and created a sales and use tax on ESDs and changed the excise tax rate on cigarettes and on wholesale priced OTP. So the price for a pack of cigarettes went up $1.75 because of the increase of $1.75 in the cigarette tax on all cigarettes. And the graph to your right gives you a breakdown of what the change was from House Bill 732. And then there's some exceptions in the OTP law where excise tax rates remain unchanged for cigars currently at 70% of wholesale cost, pipe tobacco at 30% of wholesale cost, and premium cigars at 15% of wholesale cost. And as far as efforts with the regulations and enforcement of tobacco products in the state of Maryland, I'll throw it there. We just started a program this week identifying unlicensed tobacco sellers in the state of Maryland, which is about 135 locations. And we've just started enforcement action to identify those locations, visit those locations, take the appropriate action to get them licensed or have them stop selling tobacco products.
Tony, I have a question if I may.
Sure.
Tony, and forgive me if you were planning to unpack this anyway, no pun intended, but obviously with the rates going up, the prices going up as dramatically as they have gone up as a result of legislation, there is an inevitable increase concomitantly in the occurrence of smuggling activity. And we see this every time we see an increase in the sales tax or the excise tax in cigarettes. What do we expect, both based upon our past experience and what we see happening in other states? What do we expect in terms of an increase in smuggling behavior as a result of the actions taken by the legislature, which are well-intended, timely, and to be applauded, but there is an unintended consequence that we have to be mindful of and that we need to be vigilant in containing?
Well, anytime there's a tax increase, that's been the subject of debate, especially for the state of New York, over the many years where they increased their taxes several times. And every time they increased their tax, their smuggling rate increased. I expect there probably will be an increase for the state of Maryland because of the increase of the tax. I've already taken steps and advised our field enforcement division to start conducting surveillance and investigations to try to determine if there's an increase of smuggling of tobacco products, cigarettes. We already noticed there's a large impact of OTP products coming into the state of Maryland, more so than cigarettes. In the last month, we've made, in cooperation with allied agencies, made 2 arrests regarding untaxed cigarettes coming into the state. We've also confiscated a number of sticks of cigars and other tobacco products from 2 licensed locations in the state by way of inspections that were conducted by my agents in the field. So I've advised them to increase the activity on trying to identify locations where people from the state of Maryland might go to get these products, to bring them back into the state and see if there is an increase. And then we'll take the appropriate action to try to catch those individuals.
And Tony, just to confirm the obvious, the majority of the smuggling activity tends to occur along high-density interstate corridors like US 301, I-95, US 13 coming up from Virginia into Maryland. Are we seeing those familiar patterns, or are we seeing different geographic patterns with these new products than we've seen in the past?
The information I have, those patterns remain the same. For cigarettes, it's coming from the south. For other tobacco products, it's coming from the north.
Okay. Any questions?
Tony, can I jump in with a quick question? Do you mind?
Sure.
So does the state of Maryland enforcement section or the bureau, do they work with like federal agencies for like CCTA violations?
What we do is we do participate with some investigations with federal agencies and other state and local agencies on investigations in regards to tobacco product violations, the interstate transport and so forth. So we do network. And we do have one of our agents who is assigned to a federal task force at this point that's involved in those types of investigations.
Okay.
I see Mr. Kelly wants to interject. Jeff?
Thank you. Just based on the question concerning the CCTA, those are typically companies, excuse me, many times they're companies that are legitimate, out-of-state legitimate tobacco companies that would sell cigarettes into Maryland. And years ago, they used to do that quite a bit by way of mail. People would go online to this out-of-state store, order a large quantity of cigarettes, and have them shipped into the state. And we do work with our federal partners in enforcing that. And years ago, the Attorney General from Maryland and the Comptroller combined to do a lot of undercover operations where we make these purchases online, and then we would do several things. One of them is we would notify the vendor that they were never allowed to ship into Maryland, and they were to stop. And as many of these transactions were made by credit card, we worked with the credit card and financial institutions that these types of transactions are not allowed. And lastly, as a punitive effort in some of those states and where other federal agencies were involved, the people who had made any sales into Maryland were required to submit to us a listing of who they sold to in the state. So that, in conjunction with also working with the Postal Service, showing them what packaged cigarettes look like, yielded great seizures. And we have not seen, in fact, I couldn't tell you the last time we saw any kind of a mail order cigarette seizure. And the post office became a great resource because they were ultimately the ones who were making deliveries for the most part. But so we have worked with them extensively throughout the years, and we've just kind of seen that particular issue dry up some.
What is Maryland's tax burden on cigarettes as opposed to our neighbors like in West Virginia, Pennsylvania, in Virginia, etc.?
I'll tell you what, Maryland's pretty high now at $3.75. We were fairly high at $2. We're pretty darn high now at $3.75. Consequently, Virginia is 30 cents a pack. So think about that. It's $3 a carton in Virginia. It's $37.50 a carton in Maryland. You can do the math. So what Tony was saying is we send our agents down to what we know are known tobacco stores that cater to smugglers just across the line in Virginia. And on some days you decide which vehicle you're going to take, the blue truck or the red truck, because they're all heading north. About 25% of those cigarettes are destined for Maryland. The rest of them go through Maryland to get to places like New Jersey and New York, and sometimes, oddly enough, Michigan. And Len, you're exactly right about the thoroughfares you used. You mentioned in our heyday, one popular one became Route 81 or I-81 because we were so aggressive, we were out there so much and creating such a financial burden. They only had to be exposed to Maryland for about 12 miles. So they would go way out of their way to take 81 to get through Maryland quickly rather than go through 95 and 301 and 13.
And for those of you who may be watching at home and are unfamiliar with the process of combating cigarette smuggling, I want to articulate what this is and what this is not. And I don't mean to serve as a spokesperson for the ATC or the Field Enforcement Division, but when we talk about combating cigarette smuggling, we're not talking about Uncle Ralph going across the Harry Nice Bridge into King George County to pick up a couple cartons of Marlboros and coming back across the bridge into Charles County. This is not, we're not using, by and large, if ever, we're not using state resources and state personnel for the recreational smoker. What we're talking about here is an extensive, large-scale, interstate, national in scope criminal enterprise that is every bit as lucrative as the smuggling and distribution of narcotics, but with only a fraction of the attendant legal penalties. And Jeff can articulate this, as I suspect Tony can. We even have credible evidence, at least in past years we have, where revenue from cigarette smuggling has been used to finance terrorist activities within our nation's borders.
With
So
that
this is serious stuff.
With that information, Len, when I first started in this job 20 years ago, the first Trade Center bombing, the information we had for the intelligence was that bombing was funded by cigarette smuggling. I
recall that. I recall reading about it. Tony, I think that some of our members and those watching online may also want to know with the increased popularity of electronic smoking devices, where do those products fit within the panoramic of our regulatory and enforcement activities?
Well, they fit in the end as far as the licensing requirement for them. And every store we inspect those for those products. The federal government banned, and Jeff, you can correct me if I'm wrong, because I've just jumped back into this enforcement industry again in January. But they're regulated. My understanding is that the controller, prior to the ATC being formed, had put out an order that since the federal government had banned the flavored tobacco or the flavoring within these ESDs, that the state of Maryland would not allow them to be sold, and our agents and inspectors were advised to advise any retail operation selling those to cease those sales.
Got it. Do we have any questions for Tony or for Jeff? Hearing none. If we can, I'd like to go and introduce our next presenter, Ms. Kathy Hoke from the University of Maryland Carey School of Law. And Kathy, it's good to see you again, if only online.
Hi, thanks, Len. Can you see my slides?
Yes, we can.
I can, yes, ma'am.
All of a sudden, I lost my video of you. So let me just go back to the beginning here. Okay, you can see them now, yes?
Yes,
Yes.
ma'am.
Terrific, thanks. Well, thank you for inviting me and for the generous introduction, Len. Yeah, so folks who've worked at the Field Enforcement Division, whether it was 2 decades ago or currently, are friends of mine. I've been working in the tobacco regulatory space for over 25 years, having started doing this work at the Attorney General's office in Maryland under then Attorney General Joe Curran. And then I came to the law school to run what is now called the Legal Resource Center for Public Health Policy. So my goal today is, because I thought a lot about this presentation, because I'm used to giving folks who kind of know about tobacco kind of updates on what's going on. But I know that many of you are new to the game. And so I've tried to do a broad overview of some of, first, the federal regulations that apply, and then I'll talk about some of the, I think, relevant state laws for the ATC. At any point, interrupt me with questions, and if I go too fast, if there are other issues you want me to cover at a later time, certainly let me know. I'm available to you all. So first, I'm not going to give you the history, but prior to 2009, the federal government did very little regulation of tobacco products. It really was taxation and smuggling issues, and did just the warning labels that were on the packages and on advertising. But in 2009, Congress passed what we call the Tobacco Control Act, but the full name is the Family Smoking Prevention and Tobacco Control Act. And it, for the very first time in this country, gave the FDA regulatory power over tobacco. And the FDA does that through a newly created center called the Center for Tobacco Products. I say new because in the world of FDA, a center that's only existed for 12 years is actually relatively new. So some of the provisions of the TCA I was going to cover with you here that are, I think, relevant for our conversation. Sales and marketing restrictions. You can see some of the provisions here about prohibiting the giving away of cigarettes, as well as only allowing the giving away of smokeless tobacco in adult-only facilities. That obviously is youth access centered. Prohibiting the giving away of non-tobacco products, like you used to be able to go in and if you bought 3 packs of Marlboro, you could get a Marlboro hat. Which obviously was marketing for Marlboro, and so it was a good deal for them. And so to cut down on that type of marketing, this provision was put in place. And then something consistent with Maryland law, requiring cigarettes to be sold in a minimum package of 20. That is to keep the price of access high. As we know, with our new tax, the price of a pack of cigarettes will become pretty extraordinary in Maryland. The Tobacco Control Act also has other restrictions that you may not even have realized happened. The packaging might look similar to you. Maybe you're smokers, but if not, you're probably seeing them in some of the stores that you go to. But they can no longer use certain terms: light, mild, low tar as the product descriptors, because there's significant evidence that these terms are deceptive. There's nothing safer or healthier for you in a light cigarette. In fact, there's some evidence that smokers inhale more deeply from a light cigarette or a mild cigarette, and therefore are more likely to get lung cancer because they've breathed the smoke deeper into their lungs. A couple of other provisions that relate to youth access, prohibiting self-service displays, including vending machines. So you can't go up and take the product and take it up to the counter. Back in the day when Tony and Jeff and I were first getting into this business, tobacco companies like self-service displays because they kind of tolerated youth shoplifting in order to get kids addicted, and then they would eventually come in and buy the product. So getting rid of self-service displays is youth-focused as well. Requires identification check of any customer who's under 27, best practices to ID every customer who comes in, as well as imposing a minimum age for purchase to 21, just like Maryland. That was changed in federal law in 2019. I do just want to point out the sign that you used in your PowerPoint, Tony, is the old one that says except with military ID, because the Maryland law had an exemption for military ID, but when the feds passed their law later that year, it removed, it doesn't have a military exemption. So functionally now there is no military exemption for the sale of tobacco products. And MDH is providing, newer signs and advising retailers that they can remove that language from the existing signs if they prefer. Then a couple of things at the kind of top level for FDA, things that states wouldn't be in the business of doing, I think, in short order. And so the Tobacco Control Act took it on. The first is prohibiting the sale of flavored cigarettes. Again, this was 2009, before vapes were even a thing, and before the little flavored cigars like Black and Mild and Swisher Sweet were super popular. And so it was really targeting the sale of fruity and candy flavored cigarettes. Yes, they existed, with the exception of menthol. We don't have time to get into a deep discussion about menthol, but there's a lot of discussion over trying to get the FDA to prohibit the sale of menthol. The agency does have the authority, but they have yet to take action on that point. But that only applies to cigarettes. It does allow the FDA to mandate a reduction in the nicotine levels in tobacco products. And while a couple of years ago, the agency issued a kind of new statement that that's what the focus was going to be for products. They were going to look at ways to reduce nicotine to therefore reduce addiction. And but the agency hasn't really done anything with, it was a report that they issued or a proposal that they issued in 2016, giving us a framework for doing that, but the agency really hasn't taken action there. The agency, however, by law cannot reduce nicotine to zero in the tobacco products. And then lastly, the FDA can require the elimination of any particular constituent found to be harmful. Warning labels. This has always been the federal government's job with respect to warning labels, recognizing that the product travels across the state, manufactured in one state and across the country. And so it's always been the province of the federal government in the warning labels. And in fact, states are prohibited from having their own warning labels. But under the new act, or under the Tobacco Control Act, the warnings got bigger. Maybe you noticed this a while ago, but they have to be 50% of the front and back of cigarette packaging, 30% of the front and back of smokeless packaging, and 20% of advertisement. So if it's a billboard or the side of a bus, that's the graphic warning label has to be there as well. I'll speak to when these warnings became applicable to vapes and other type of tobacco products. The Act does also require that the FDA impose graphic warnings, so pictorial warnings that we see across the globe. Many countries have, diseased lungs, diseased gums, and other pictures that, have been demonstrated to be effective in reducing smoking initiation and increasing cessation. But the FDA's original set of rules was struck down in court in 2012. They had to get sued, in fact, by public health entities saying, you can't sit on this forever. You have to go back to the drawing board. And they finally did last year issue a new set of graphic warning labels. They were supposed to go into effect last year, but with the pandemic, they pushed the deadline to October of 2021. However, there is a lawsuit pending because, of course, there is. If you learn one thing in tobacco is that tobacco companies love lawyers. They love to employ lawyers. And so we'll see what happens with the graphic warnings. This is important for one reason, and it really relates to vapes, but the Tobacco Control Act specifically says that if a product was not on the market prior to February 27, or what we call the predicate product, a very similar product, a product that looks, smells and talks like an existing product. If it wasn't on the market as of February 2007, the product has to be go through what we call the PMTA, the Pre-Market Tobacco Product Application Process. And the FDA will have to authorize the sale of any new product before it can come on the market. And in considering whether to allow a product to come onto the market, the FDA can restrict advertising or marketing of the product, or any aspect of the product itself. I'll touch on how this applies to vape products shortly. Another provision relates to reduced harm product. We did see in the 90s and early 2000s tobacco companies starting to market products that they claimed were reduced harm, that they would present less risk of morbidity and mortality in the community. And so the Tobacco Control Act makes clear that a manufacturer of a tobacco product may not make health claims about their product without approval of the FDA, and there is an extensive system set up for the FDA to assess, with most of the burden falling on the applicant, the manufacturer, who wants to be able to say these things. And here too, you can see some applications have been approved. That information might be a little outdated. There might be a couple of others, but snus, which is a smokeless tobacco that comes in a pouch, and then IQOS and Marlboro heat sticks are actually heat not burn. So they are not combustible. They're cigarettes that don't burn, but they get heated and consumed in that way. And so both of those types of products have been subject or authorized by the PMTA, but subject to a lot of restrictions that controls the marketing of the product. So it's not, oh, yep, you're approved and you can say whatever you want about the product. There are quite a few restrictions. As we shift into I'll talk in a moment about state and local regulation in Maryland, but just so that you know, the Tobacco Control Act actually importantly did alleviate a previously existing comprehensive preemption clause that really prohibited states and local governments from regulating tobacco marketing in significant ways. And so the Tobacco Control Act reversed that. And so now, as you can see in red here, state and local governments can regulate time, place, what we call time, place, manner, right? Time, place, location, the size, the color, where ads may be. They may not regulate the content of those advertisements. Number one, there's also First Amendment implications, but they're preempted from doing so. And this also is where not being allowed to require or change the warning labels. That is solely the province of the federal government. So in most other areas that relate to like the sale and distribution of tobacco products, who can buy, who can sell, where and how, and all those rules, the things that Tony talked to you about, on his provision, is all left to state and local governments for the most part. So there's not federal preemption there. When the Tobacco Control Act was first, when it was passed, it gave the FDA regulatory authority over all tobacco products, but specifically had provisions related to cigarettes and smokeless tobacco products, and said to the FDA, if you want to regulate other types of tobacco products, you have to deem them covered by the Tobacco Control Act, and then they will fall within your jurisdiction. Frankly, FDA fuddled about and didn't do much with this, and so cigars weren't included for the longest time. We at the Legal Resource Center actually filed a citizens petition with the FDA to get them to actually include specifically the little cigars, the Black and Mild Swisher Sweets and the like, the candy flavored cigars, very attractive to young people. Years before they finally issued this deeming rule. But in 2014, they issued this rule, and in 2016, it went into effect. And essentially, what it says is all tobacco products. Any product that meets the definition of a tobacco product under the Act is now covered by the FDA's regulatory authority. And probably what's most important for folks now is the electronic cigarette part, or I often refer to them as vapes. And so now those came within the FDA's regulatory power. But you might say, wait, how are they on the market then? They were not on the market prior to February of 2007, and so they should be considered new products and have to go through that PMTA process that I told you about. Well, the FDA recognized that when they were issuing the deeming rule that they were either going to create a situation where, hundreds of products were on the market unlawfully, and they'd have to deal with that from an enforcement perspective, or they would allow them to stay on the market. And they kind of split the baby, if you will, and said, we are allowing these products to remain on the market for a period of time until manufacturers can get their PMTA, their pre-market approval applications submitted. There's a whole history behind the moving of that date. It was actually kept getting pushed back and pushed back again until public health entities sued the FDA and said, enough with this. You're supposed to be regulating these products and you must. And so the PMTA deadline actually occurred last year. And so now vape product manufacturers, there you can see on your screens the rules that they have to follow, which are similar to those, the same as those for other products coming onto the market. But they have submitted those PMTAs at this point. The health warnings are related to nicotine consumption. So a lot of the smoking health warnings wouldn't be apt for vape products, but because they're nicotine containing products, they will contain the warnings that relate to nicotine. Importantly, child resistant packaging was added because early on with vape products, we know children were able to gain access to the little vials or tubes or containers of the vape liquid, and it is highly concentrated levels of nicotine, and a child could become very sick. I mean, ultimately could die, but principally become very sick from consuming that. And so, that's an important provision here. And then lastly, they can't make those. Remember, I said the reduced harm claims can't be made. They can't make those types of claims. And we all know that the product is at least subtly marketed as safer for consumption than cigarettes, but they're technically not permitted to make those types of claims about the products. And so again, here, finally, the deadline for filing of those applications occurred last year. And I just wanted to point out a couple of things. First is, as Tony referenced, there has been regulation with respect to flavoring. And I'll get to that shortly, but their PMTAs have to address the impact on flavoring, specifically on youth and youth uptake of the product. And they have to contain a variety of other, provisions. The real problem that we have right now is there's no indication from the FDA as to how long a product is going to be allowed to stay on the market while the PMTA is pending. I don't see how the agency gets these PMTAs done in a year, which was their goal. There were just too many and they're too significant, but we'll see. So we just don't know how long, for example, Juul is going to be able to remain on the market while its PMTA is just pending. I will say the agent, yep.
Kathy, I don't mean to interrupt you, but I believe Commissioner Buck has a question.
Sure.
And I have a question.
Yeah, great, go ahead.
I was born and raised in the alcohol industry, and a lot of our alcohol stores do handle tobacco, but two of the tobacco products you talked about, I've never heard of, and I'd like to know what they are. What is a nicotine gel and what is a dissolvable?
Sure. And I'm sorry that I can't see your hands going up because I have my slides up on my screen. So that was perfect, Len, to just cut me off because I'll just keep going. So Commissioner Buck, nicotine gel was, it was a rage for a period of time. It's kind of faded, but it literally was, looked just like your antibacterial stuff that you're putting on your hands all the time now, except that it had nicotine in it. And it was purportedly a way for folks who were either not able to use their tobacco product for a period of time, either when they were indoors in places where it wasn't permitted, they were having a surgery or something, or they just otherwise wanted to be able to ingest nicotine in a way other than oral consumption. You would just rub it on your hands. and it would give you a tingle at first. I actually purchased some back in the day. It can give you a tingle at first, and then presumably would get into your bloodstream and give you that nicotine rush. I will say that I'm not a tobacco user, but I've tried lots of the new products that come on the market. And I usually, if it actually contains nicotine, will have a significant reaction because I don't use nicotine. But I had zero reaction to the nicotine gel when I tried it. And I do think that it ultimately was pretty unsuccessful as a product for that reason. Dissolvables is another story, and they are still on the market in a variety of different ways. Some of them, probably the most popular one, looks like a giant Tic Tac, right? So it's a container of them. They're spherical. They look, again, like maybe 2 or 3 times the size of a regular Tic Tac, and it is compressed tobacco with some flavoring. Typically, again, it almost might taste like a candy, and you pop it in your mouth and consume it that way. Again, you're not getting the smoke and less direct oral, impact from the tobacco because it's compressed into this little dissolvable. But you can use that again when you're not permitted to smoke for whatever reason, or some people may be kind of self-prescribing as a way to help them stop smoking. So those are the 2 products. Again, the gel didn't really fly. There was also nicotine water and nicotine lollipop, so many different nicotine containing products, but a lot of them just don't fly with consumers. Len?
Thank you, Kathy. I think some people who are watching your presentation, and I'm going back a couple of slides here, might say, well, I hear you when you say that a tobacco supplier, manufacturer, can't make claims about cessation or any other beneficial outcomes to the consumer unless specifically authorized by the FDA. But at the same time, isn't that kind of a core element of the marketing strategy of the vaping industry, that this is a healthier, safer alternative to tobacco consumption? Isn't that what's happening, if not formally, then certainly informally in the consumer marketplace today?
Yes, you would make a great focus group, Len, because this is exactly the problem. And so with tongue in cheek, I say, but that's not what they're doing. If you look very carefully at their advertising, I will say that the advertising and marketing for the products has changed significantly over the course of the last 2 years or so, when much more attention was being paid to it. But in some respects, the quote damage was done because they were actively promoted as either cessation devices or as reduced harm products. And I think equally important and kind of frustratingly, the folks who sell, so not the manufacturers, but the retailers and then particularly vape shop vendors, certainly tell their customers, that this is a way to quit smoking. I should say this, they also can't be marketed as cessation devices. If you're going to market something as a cessation device, it's a whole nother layer of FDA approval that you have to have. So, but vape shop vendors surely are marketing them. I hear it all the time as cessation devices and as reduced harm. I will tell you this, if you love someone and they smoke combustible, cigarettes or cigar, or, little cigars, and they say they're going to transition to vaping, okay, that's better. But it's about, the same decision as whether you're gonna take a little arsenic with your breakfast or a lot of it, right? And so neither is good for you. And so when we talk about kind of reduced harm between combustible cigarette use, the worst thing probably that you can do for your body, and using vapes, then there is some differential. And there's been a lot of pressure put on the FDA to do something about this marketing, particularly in social media. Like, y'all aren't seeing it either because I don't see it because I'm 54 and I don't have TikTok and things like that. But the marketing that they do to our kids through social media is intense. And so you're right, Len. I guess the bottom line is you're right. The messaging, at least implied, is that the products are reduced harm, but none of them have actually even submitted an application to be approved as a reduced harm product. So,
Kathy, thank you. And
of course.
please carry on.
Yep.
Thank you.
Do you mind if I jump in with a real quick question?
Sure, Rob.
This is Robert Poole. The question number 1 is the health effects of nicotine by itself. as opposed to the consumption of the combustibles. Number one, and number two, does the Alcohol Tobacco Tax Commission are they still charged with the labeling, or is that now an FDA function?
So on your first question, Commissioner Poole, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a medical professional, but there is, I know what the data tells us. There are, particularly in young people, a series of negative health consequences associated with nicotine consumption. I mean, almost all wraps around the addiction problem, right, or the dependence problem, and having the highs and lows that you go through during the course of a day when you're fine, you're feeling settled because you have your nicotine, and now it's going out of your bloodstream and you get agitated, you can't pay attention in school, you might feel nauseous, you consume your nicotine and you go back up. So we know, at least from a youth perspective, kind of interference with ability to receive their education, to pay attention, to be moody, which of course teenagers are already moody, so let's not blame the nicotine for that. But even for adults, there can be, in some ways similar to caffeine, there can be health consequences associated with just the consumption of nicotine. But consumption of clean nicotine, so nicotine that is being used as what we call nicotine replacement therapy, drugs that have been approved by the FDA that contain nicotine that are to help you stop using tobacco products, is a much safer, delivery option. And then on the labeling, do you mean the graphic warning? I mean, I'm sorry, the warnings that are on the packages?
So the original warnings, that were, I think ATF was originally responsible. Then that jurisdiction moved over to the Alcohol Tobacco Tax Commission. Do they still? I'm sorry. The Alcohol Tobacco. I can't remember the name now. But
you mean the Center for Tobacco Products at FDA?
No. So did FDA take over all of the jurisdiction? Then that's my question.
So FDA took. The federal government has always had the jurisdiction over regulating what the health warnings have to be on the packaging and making sure that they're on there. So it remains with the FDA at this point.
Okay, that's all I need. Thank you.
Okay, great, sure. So a little bit more on vapes and flavors in particular, because Tony introduced this earlier, but as I indicated, since the vapes were only allowed on the market because the FDA was exercising that enforcement discretion. The FDA withdrew enforcement discretion with respect to certain flavored products last year. And those relate to cartridge-based, like Juul or Soren, where they have the cartridge. And you can see here also other vape products where the manufacturer is not taking adequate measures to protect against minors' access, or if they're marketing to minors. Those were just thrown in there as, we can pull your product off of the market if we find that you're marketing them to kids. But as Len pointed out, with them marketing them as safer, they're clearly marketing them to kids, and the FDA is not really, well, they have pulled some products off of the market, like Sour Patch Kids flavored vape liquid. But that first element is what's most important, and that made Juul and Juul-like products have to go flavor free. They can have they can have menthol or tobacco flavored products. And so that was a pretty significant change. Peter Franchot, of course, our comptroller, recognized that there was a type of product. It's a flavored disposable vape. Probably the most popular one's called Puff Bars, Puff, Puff Bars, and they were disposable ones, so they didn't have that cartridge that the FDA was regulating here. And so in addition to issuing the notice about the FDA's banning and the Field Enforcement Division's role in enforcing that, the comptroller closed that gap and said, in Maryland, we're not going to have flavored disposable products. Flavors are still permitted in those open tank systems, what the vape shops are selling, and probably what most adults see, or most adults are using those, older adults are using those types of products where you actually refill. I could relate back to Tony's slide, but I don't have a picture here. So quick, question?
Kathy, very simple question. The open tank systems where you have someone in a back room that's creating the liquids that goes into a detachable, that is poured into a detachable cartridge. Who or what has regulatory authority over those businesses and those products right now?
So both FDA and ATC. So now ATC, those when they're mixing it up in the back, they're actually manufacturers. They can also be a vape shop vendor because they're selling it at retail. But if they're actually mixing batches in the back, they actually qualify as a vape manufacturer and have to be licensed accordingly. I will say something that I think the ATC should take into consideration, and I didn't come here to say these things, but since you mention it, there really aren't regulations about kind of safe handling practices for these things. So I don't know what the health and hygiene aspects of those stores looks like, right? So are the vats open? Are they closed? Do staff have to have hair nets and gloves, et cetera? What are the handling practices that we might just purely from a hygiene perspective want to impose on those shops that are actually manufacturing the product in the store and then selling it to consumers? Answer your question?
It does. And I'm going to leave with one last question. Yeah. I think this might be for Jeff or for Tony, given the fact that there are, if not countless, certainly numerous stores that are creating these products around the state. Are both of you gentlemen confident that we have enough enforcement resources to make sure that we are adequately regulating for both the safety and the integrity of these products?
Well, I'll try that first. That's a question usually a legislator would ask. And I have to say that I'm funded sufficiently to carry out the mission that I have to carry out. Having said that, we could absolutely use more agents and inspectors. The safety element of it's a little tricky for us because, quite frankly, we're not health professionals in any stretch and don't really know what all the requirements are to maintain a healthy working environment or a healthy manufacturing environment. From a standpoint of just simply trying to conduct sufficient inspections, there are about, give or take, maybe 7,000 or so various different types of tobacco retailers across the state, tobacco, OTP, electronic smoking devices. And we try to get to about 40% or so of them a year. It's not easy to do, but that's our goal. That's what we shoot for, is at least 40% of the amount that are out there, so that hopefully every 2 years, maybe every 2.5 years, we're visiting somebody and they see us. That's the practicality of it. I had certainly hoped and still continue to hope that as the ATC grows or matures, that it grows in size with inspectors and agents, because I think that's key to keeping a safe environment for all of it, for alcohol and tobacco.
Jeff, thank you.
And I would just concur with Jeff just said. He said everything I would have said. The last check I made for 2019, the last licensure year before COVID cut off renewals of licenses, we had over 65,000 licensed premises for tobacco products. And I would say a majority of those would also include the selling of vape products.
Tony, with 65,000 or 6,500?
Oh, I'm sorry, 6,500.
I didn't think I was off to that much. Okay.
Don't worry, I was going to correct him, Jeff.
Sorry about that. The 6,500.
The only time you want to see an extra zero is in your paycheck.
Yes.
And Kathy, in the interest of time, I'll yield the floor back to you so you can conclude the presentation.
Yep. So I just wanted to run through a couple of the state laws that are relevant. What I just gave you was kind of the federal regulatory framework, which my guess is most of you didn't know much about, and I didn't expect you to. So it was a lot. Again, happy to come back, happy to talk to you individually, et cetera. But there are important state laws where the collaboration formerly between the comptroller and the state and local health departments, and now ATC and the state and local health departments, is critically important. And so they mainly focus on youth access, right? So state law, there are 3 provisions that I've set out here. As you can see, criminal law does prohibit the sale of tobacco products. In Maryland, vapes are not included in the definition of tobacco product. They're separately defined. So the criminal law provision only applies to tobacco products and has to be enforced or can only be enforced by a sworn law enforcement officer. So in consequence kind of to that, or as a response to that, over time, the General Assembly has passed these other two provisions that you can see, 24305 and 24307, that actually allow the local health department to use either their internal staff, law enforcement officers, maybe contracting with their sheriff's department, or often they hire retired law enforcement officers, like I believe the retired major who's on the phone today. Often folks are hired to do these jobs, and so they do the undercover sting operations and use these provisions of the code. I just want to point out at the bottom there that in Maryland and in many states now, state law does not prohibit minors from possessing, using, or purchasing tobacco products. It is just the sale to them that is unlawful, because those laws were being used in, frankly, abusive and discriminatory manners and had no impact on youth access to tobacco. So the General Assembly got rid of them in 2019. I want to point out, too, that you may see reference to a local law that prohibits the sale of tobacco products to minors. For example, Baltimore City, Montgomery County, Baltimore County, they have local provisions that prohibit the sale of tobacco to minors as a civil infraction, and they have total control in the local jurisdiction over that. So they conduct the enforcement. They retain the fines if they, act under those provisions. And in some of them, instead of going to court for, if somebody is appealing a citation, instead of going to court, they'll go to a local administrative body. For example, the Environmental Control Board in Baltimore City hears those cases. Then there are two other things that are going on at the state level with respect to youth access that you might hear referenced, and I want you to understand. SINAR compliance checks. Actually named for Mike Sinar, a late senator from U.S. Congress, created a federal law that mandates that states conduct compliance checks to determine whether tobacco retailers are selling tobacco to kids. And if a state fails to meet the 20% or below sales number, the state can risk losing millions of dollars in federal substance use funding. This is the way the federal government controls everything the states do, right? By controlling the funding. Citations are not issued, but the sales are documented. The retailers know that they failed, and there is documentation of that through MDH. I do want to point out that Maryland stands alone as one of the only, or the only state in the recent past to have ever violated SINAR. And so we were, for a 2-year period of time, in jeopardy with the federal government, and they required us to pump a significant amount of increased funding to our youth tobacco enforcement program in order to bring our access rates down. So we were failing. I believe we hit sales rates of about 40%. Meaning, 4 out of 10 times a kid was going to be able to buy a tobacco product at a Maryland retailer. Because those monies have been pumped back into the enforcement programs, we've been able to keep our numbers down. But that's critically important. And also the FDA law does prohibit the sale of tobacco to minors, and they do conduct their own enforcement checks and use federal law, which actually has pretty significant fines. They usually issue warnings, and they can also issue what they call stop orders, not allowing, for a week, not allowing a retailer to continue to send tobacco products. Only the federal government can enforce the federal law, but they have deputized agents at the Behavioral Health Administration at the Maryland Department of Health to do those. What is the role of ATC in all of this? So with respect to youth access, primarily it relates to license suspension and revocation. So I have laid out here the business regulation article provisions for cigarettes, OTP, and vapes that apply here and speak to the process and the rules for whether, when, and how the ATC can suspend or revoke a tobacco retailer's license for selling product, well, for lots of reasons, but including for selling products to kids. And so you can see first offenses with a suspension, subsequent offense, for a longer suspension. And if a retailer is willfully and persistently violating the law, they may suffer from revocation of their license. This is a process, that was the hearing process that we have worked out between the comptroller's office and the local health departments. really was ironed out over many years and works pretty seamlessly. And it was a great accomplishment when we were able to get the first licensees that were chronic sellers to at least suffer some licensure action, and very proud of the relationship that we built with the Field Enforcement Division to get that done. So we hope on behalf of all of the local health departments that make these referrals that we'll be able to continue that relationship seamlessly with ATC. And then just a couple of other provisions that relate to, that were Field Enforcement Division and are now ATC responsibilities. Minimum pack size for cigarettes of 20. As I mentioned previously, there's actually a Sales Below Cost Act in the commercial law article. Probably not terribly important, but I wanted to throw it on there. Mandating that retailers display their license, that it be available, that if you walk in, you should be able to see it. And that's an ATC enforcement issue, as well as I think covered nicely earlier, the payment of taxes. Last point, and that is that prior to 2013, our local governments around the state were very actively engaged in regulating tobacco product sales. And for example, they imposed their own civil citations for sales to minors. Some imposed requirements that tobacco products be behind the counter before it was part of federal law. But in 2013, Prince George's County had passed a local law prohibiting the sale of little cigars in packs under size 5. And the tobacco industry sued, and they actually prevailed on the point that state law preempts local governments from regulating with respect to tobacco sales. And so they overturned the Prince George's County ordinance, and for 8 years now, our local governments have mustered under this implied preemption that was found by the Court of Appeals. And I just wanted to point out to you, because I know as you move forward, understanding what's happening in the legislature with respect to tobacco regulation will be important, that there is a pending bill and hasn't been voted on in either committee, as I checked yesterday, but nowadays things happen pretty quickly, but that would actually restore that local tobacco regulatory power, overturning Altadis. So that's what I had. I answered questions during it, but I'm happy to answer anything else that you might have.
Kathy, that's exceptional work. Thank you so much for a thorough and timely overview. And
I'm trying to stop sharing. Okay, there you go.
Ask quickly if any of my fellow commissioners have questions. Hearing none, Kathy, if you would be willing to just send out a message in the chat portion of Teams to our fellow commissioners where they can reach you if you do have further questions, I think that would be helpful.
Sorry, and also Tony, I'll send you my slides so that you may share them with others.
Wonderful,
okay.
That would be great.
Sure.
Kathy, again, thank you very much. Tony and Jeff, thank you as well for contributing to really one of the best conversations I've heard on this topic in quite some time. And at this point, I'm going to turn the floor back to Tony and by extension, Jeff, who can update us on goings on in the Maryland General Assembly as we head into the final weeks of our session.
Okay, I'm going to touch on the bills that I've seen have had activity that are going through the both houses. I'll start with Senate Bill 883. This creates a new section of law for business regulations, Title 16.9 for out-of-state sales of premium cigars and pipe tobacco. It has gone through second reader. So it was scheduled, I thought, for third reader today, which might occur after 5 o'clock when the House goes back in session, or the Senate goes back in session. So that's coming, I'm quite sure. House Bill 12 has gone through second reader. This one is an alcohol bill that provides for the delivery of drinks to residents and customers, but it must be in conjunction with a food delivery. House Bill 185 has crossed over to the Senate after passing the House. The bill prohibits the requirement of a customer to purchase more than one drink upon entering an establishment. Now, I heard that the basis for this bill was such places as the Block in Baltimore, where you had, if coming in, you had to buy at least 2 drinks before you could come in. So that bill would stop that activity. The next one I found is House Bill 422. That has moved to the Senate. it's a requirement from the governor's office of the minority participation in the alcoholic beverages industry. A study must move over to the Senate. It requires the governor's office of the small minority and women business affairs to conduct a study of the participation of minority-owned businesses in the alcoholic beverages industry. Now, there are the bills that I have found that have recently been active and are currently moving. The rest of the bills are still in committee and have not moved out of the committee that I've been watching.
Okay. Any questions for Tony? Okay. Hearing none, we are in the home stretch now. Our final item of new business is one for which I'm going to turn to Murray Singerman, our legal counsel. And this has to do with the protocols that this commission, and obviously in my absence, will organize our meetings, organize our basic commission governance structure, and we're looking for some guidance on how to go about conducting the business of the ATC during these meetings. I think I introduced the topic at the conclusion of our last meeting in February. And Murray, do you have any thoughts or do you have any suggestions on how we can guide this conversation?
So the overriding issue that you run into is it would be very easy to adopt Robert's Rules of Orders and then be done with it. The problem is that Robert's Rules of Order conflicts with the Open Meetings Act. And my suggestion at this point is that Tony and Jeff and I guess Barbara at this point after this meeting and the other commissioners sit down and have a discussion, come up with a suggestion on how to operate, have a base on which to operate, and make sure that there's compliance with the Open Meetings Act. But so I would suggest that we put it as an agenda item for the next meeting and then come up with some specific suggestions, and then somebody can make a motion and then move it into and approve it.
Barbara, are you comfortable with that, since this would fall into your lap at this point?
Yeah, I think that sounds fine.
Okay. Murray, do we have to move to postpone the item or to defer the item, or can we just let it die for lack of action?
I think at this point, somebody could make a motion that I guess Barbara and I, Tony, come up with some suggestions that we'll circulate and then vote on at the next meeting. I think that's the way it would be best handled.
Okay. Do we have a motion to that effect?
I'll motion for that.
And I'll second it.
Okay, we have a motion by Barbara to convene a small group, Tony, Murray, and Barbara, to come up with a proposal for how to organize the meetings moving forward so that we are in compliance with the Open Meetings Act. It's been seconded by Betty. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Hearing none, the motion passes.
Len? Yeah, I just wanted to make one more comment. I would just say, up to date, we've been doing great and complying. The conflict is with when you want to have a closed meeting. That's where it really becomes a problem, and how you handle that.
Okay. Duly noted. So there'll be an item for consideration when you take this conversation offline and bring a proposal back in April. And our next meeting in April, do we have the date and time?
The third Thursday would be the 15th, I think.
That's correct, the 15th.
Which used to be a pretty busy day around these parts, and looks like we're getting a little bit of a reprieve this year. So the next meeting is Thursday, the 15th of April, 3 o'clock, presumably back on Microsoft Teams. Correct? Okay. Are there any other items to be brought to the floor for discussion? Okay. Hearing none, do we have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The meeting is adjourned. Thank you all, and I look forward to seeing you all again soon. Take care,
Yeah.
and thanks for everything.
Thank you, Len.
Thank you.
Thank you.